Good morning, everyone. This is the third video in the series of 4 relating to the legal issues of free and open source software, focusing specifically on copyright. This third video will look at how to use and how to manage different legal aspects of FOSS licensing. And it is divided basically into two different sections. The first is different ways of using FOSS and how this impacts the legal management. And the second section, we will look at different issues of license compatibility, changing licensing, dual licensing, which is basically the management of FOSS licenses from a copyright perspective. So in the first section, we will look at how FOSS projects are articulated and how they use open source software and how this impacts the legal issues. This diagram shows you a very simplified view of a normal, very simple open source project where software is built internally by developers. This may be, for example, a university project with two students developing new software. There is no reuse of old or existing open source components. Everything is new. And in this case, the only real issue to manage in terms of FOSS licensing is the choice of license. In this image, the scenario gets a bit more complicated because the internal developers are now reusing inbound or existing open source components and incorporating them into the project and relicensing or distributing the project to third parties. In this case, the new issues you can see in green are obviously the need to check the license on the inbound open source components, the compatibility with your license, and ensure compliance with this license in terms of outbound work. And finally, a more advanced project would be the same, but in this time now we have feedback and contributions coming back from the community to the project or to the open source component projects or our project. In this case, we need to look at what are the legal mechanisms or instruments used for the licensing or assignment of the rights from the community here back to the project. This is the red ones. So these are three very simplified versions of open source projects. And the idea here is to look at how we need to manage these legal issues. Okay? And depending on how it's used, the legal issues will vary. So we have to drill down one level of detail to comment on some scenarios of how the actual software code is used in the new project. For example, by incorporating into the code here, basically copy-pasting or embedding the existing software component in green into our new blue code. This would be called integrating or merging and combining together to create a new software. Okay, linking is another way of joining or reusing software components by way of calls, by either static or dynamic linking. In this sense, the third-party code is used as a library and its functions are used by our new blue software here. And again, depending on how this is done, this may have a legal impact in terms of licensing and license compliance. Modification is another way. We obviously take an existing software application and then improve it or extend it by adding our new code into this and removing other code. So here we'll have basically an adapted or modified open source code. And finally, another scenario would be, for example, where you take an existing code and you want to update it to a different computer language or compile it for a different environment or port it to a new operating system or a chip. And this, here we'd have what one would call translation. Another scenario where FOSS open source code is maybe used is where you're using open source development tools, and in compiling and creating the final material, you'll be reusing existing materials, libraries from that development environment and putting it into the resulting application here in the blue bit here. So these are different scenarios where open source is used, and what we want to focus on in the second part of this is exactly what are the issues that need to be managed and how to manage those issues in terms of FOSS licensing. We will look at FOSS compatibility and linking. We will look at the question of changing licenses and dual licensing. Okay, and depending on how we use it, this could be very different. Okay, the question of license compliance is not the focus of this materials. Marco Cicciona's materials will look at this later on. Today we're looking at license selection, compatibility, and other forms of licensing. So, in the original project, where there was no third-party components, the basic issue was to choose a license. And in this case, there are a variety of factors apart from one's own personal choice. There are many software projects where the lead developer says, I want to use the BSD, or I want to use the GPL, for no specific reason other than they think that this is the best license. However, there are factors to take into account, and obviously the first one is if you are using third-party components, are they copyleft, and do they require you to maintain the same license? In this case, obviously, you have no license choice, you have to use the same license. But apart from that, there are external factors that often impact your choice of a software license, whether it's the type of software, type of user, or type of service. In this case, you would think of a difference between a software made for developers and software for end users. Whether the software interacts with third-party software like database connectors, this also impacts your license. Whether the software is part of a larger ecosystem, for example in Ruby or Perl, where the developers usually use the same license. Also, the business model may impact this. For example, if you want to create a software which third parties can improve and extend in a professional environment, maybe you wouldn't use a strong copyleft license, looking more for something permissive or weak copyleft. Also, you may be bound by legal requirements. In Spain, for example, all public authorities can only release software under a license which is fully or partly copyleft. Also, there are issues such as trademark control and other issues like this. So these are factors which you need to take into account when you're thinking of choosing your license. And the main questions that the projects look at are whether they want a copyleft license or a permissive license. This is probably the strongest division between one side or the other. And if you do choose a copyleft license, do you want a weak one or a strong one? This has an enormous impact on your community and on a business model, if there is a business model, and the dynamics of your community. Also, you may want to choose a more recent, modern license if there's a family of licenses like GPL2, GPL3, MPL, Mozilla, MPL1 or 2. As they have been updated, they have been made more international and include provisions relating to patents and other things like this. So, and finally, of course, you are not necessarily stuck to one license. You can choose a regime of dual or multiple licensing. This is license selection. After that, we have to look at license compatibility. This arises when we are using, in the second scenario we saw, when we are using different open source components under different licenses. And compatibility basically means that we need to ensure that the obligations of those two licenses are not incompatible. For example, if you have a software, copyleft software under copyleft A, and you combine it with another copyleft software under copyleft B, these two copyleft licenses oblige you to relicense under exactly the same license. And you won't know if it should be A or B. So these licenses are incompatible. Okay. On the other hand, if you are incorporating permissive code like the BSD into a GPL project, this is no problem because the obligations of the BSD do not conflict with the obligations of the GPL. Please notice, of course, that this is a one-way street. BSD code can be used in a GPL2 project, but you cannot reuse GPL code in a BSD project. Okay, so this is the question of compatibility, And we need to look at it at both levels among components, so among all the different components that you are using. And I have seen this sometimes between 45, 50, up to 120 or 200 different third-party components are being reused in a large software project. And then we need to look at the compatibility between all those components and the overall product license. So as a function of those components, is my project license compatible, and am I complying with all the license terms when I redistribute my code? Okay, so here we have a table, for example, how the from the Free Software Foundation, and how they view compatibility from permissive licenses, which are forward compatible for weak copyleft, which are forward compatible towards strong copyleft. In this sense, this is specific to the GPL family, as they have done this on purpose, and to make things compatible this way. So, for dealing, license incompatibility causes lots of headaches, because sometimes you'd have to remove code which is incompatible with your license. So, how to solve these issues? Well, the first way is to use permissively licensed code. This makes it very easy. Or to use weak copyleft code, which doesn't enter into conflict with your license. And finally, there are solutions for strong copyleft, which have specific annexes or compatibility clauses allowing the code to be reused in different scenarios. We'll see that the class path exception does this. The EUPL has an annex of compatible licenses, and the Mozilla public license is compatible with the GPL family unless the author says, no, I only want it to be MPL. Just these ways of dealing with that. The main issue of compatibility arises when you combine or interact two different software components. And these are the pictures I was showing you before of embedding, linking, merging, or whatever, modifying. Okay, this is often called linking, although in fact it isn't always carried out through dynamic or static linking. Okay, and the question has always been whether if you use a library or link to another software in terms of functionality, does the combination of those two components create a derivative work or a composed work, compilation, that attracts the GPL copyleft clause? So when you are combining a GPL library with another work, does the use of that library, the GPL2 library, mean that your whole work has to be under the GPL code? And for a lot of people this is the case. And the lesser GPL exists so that you can use a lesser GPL library without this happening. Okay, but this is a legal analysis, and it depends on the facts, it depends on the legal jurisdiction, it depends on how the code was created and the different aspects, technical aspects. Okay, so this is one of the hottest issues that has to be dealt with and looked at in terms of copyleft licensing. Okay, some general guidelines are that obviously permissively licensed works can be used in any manner, there's no copyleft. Usually weak copyleft licenses do not affect larger works which use those libraries, and people have added exceptions to the strong one to make this possible. The third and fourth issues to do with licensing here. Often people say, well, can I change my license from Apache to GPL or GPL to Apache? The answer is yes, you can, if you are the rights holder of all the rights in the code. So obviously, if there are many different rights holders, like in the GNU Linux kernel, then you need the consent of all the rights holders to be able to change the project license. Okay, obviously, if it's just yours, this is very easy. Okay, so some projects have tried to do this, especially when they want to upgrade from an old license like GPL v2 to a more modern license, GPL v3, or go permissive from copyleft to permissive. And they encountered problems like they cannot find the right holders, or some of the rights holders don't want the change. And when you do this, you need to think about what is the impact this will have on the community. Will a copyleft community be happy to change to a permissive community style? And also, what will be the impact of your new license on third-party software which is using your software as a library? Finally, there is the question, people say, well, can I license under 2 licenses? And the answer is yes, and many people do this. Okay, rights holders, because they have 100% of the rights, let's say, can do what they want with their software, and they can license it twice under 2 different licenses. A very typical scenario is like the MySQL scenario, where there is a FOSS license for the community, and commercial entities that don't want the GPL obligations can purchase a proprietary license. Or some projects use 2 different FOSS licenses, mainly to ensure increased compatibility. There are many Spanish open source public projects which use the EUPL, which is recommended by the law, but also use the LGPL v3 as a more well-known license that is more popular in other countries. Again, you could also use 2 different licenses for 2 different parts of your code. Imagine you have a client-server scenario. You could have the client under 1 license and the server under another. So this strategy is called dual licensing, and it is often used either for commercial purposes to get revenue from a proprietary license, or more common in the FOSS environment is to ensure maximum compatibility with your code with other projects. So in this third video, what we have looked at is managing the different FOSS licensing aspects in the life of a project. We've looked at different scenarios of showing when and how the legal issues arise in terms of license selection, license compatibility. Later on you will see the questions of license compliance, and we have looked at issues of choosing a license, changing a license, and using 2 or more licenses for the software. Thank you very much.